Hello, this is the video lecture for the nervous system. So the nervous system we divide into two sections, the CNS, which is the central nervous system, and the PNS. So these are the two divisions. And the PNS is the peripheral nervous system. So the CNS consists of the brain, the spinal cord, and the spinal nerves. And then the peripheral nervous system is just everything else. So all the other nerves outside of that brain, spinal cord, and spinal nerves. So all the nerves head into the muscles, sending information throughout the rest of the body. So we're going to talk about the CNS first. So if we're going to talk about a couple parts of the brain. So I mean, there's many parts in the brain, but we're only responsible. You only need to know about 3 different ones. So let's talk about the cerebrum. The cerebrum is also known as the forebrain because it's the most frontal part of the brain. Okay, so it's also the largest part of the brain. And it's responsible for thinking. I'm just going to put resp for responsible. For thinking, producing and understanding language, so it's basically the part of the brain that's capable of thought, right? So the cerebrum is interesting. It has a couple different cool things about it. So first of all, it has ridges and grooves. So I'm sure you guys have seen pictures of brains, right? And they always have that kind of jaggedy look to them. And then there's all like the little wrinkles all over, like kind of like a head of cauliflower. So those are called, the ridges are gyri. So that's plural. Gyrus is singular. And there's grooves. And the word for that one is sulci. Sulci. Or sulcus for singular. Sulcus. That sounds like a familiar term, doesn't it? Do you guys recall back in the digestive system, we talked about the gingival sulcus, and that was that little groove right beside the gingiva and the tooth, right? So when we're flossing, where we put that floss into. So that's a sulcus. It's a groove, just the way the sulcus or sulci plural in the brain is a groove. So gyri is ridges, sulci are grooves. Another interesting thing about the cerebrum is that it's divided into hemispheres. So my super beautiful drawing of the brain right here, you can see that there's kind of those 2 lobes, or there's 2 hemispheres of it. So these are like crisscrossed. So the left hemisphere actually controls the right side of the body. And then vice versa. And then so the right controls the left. So I think that's kind of a cool and interesting thing about the brain, is that it kind of has that switch over there. So another part of the brain that you should know about, so we have the cerebrum, you should also know about the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is a smaller part of the brain than the cerebrum. It's located more towards the back of the brain. This guy is responsible for posture, coordination, and balance, and speech to some degree as well. So this is an important one to know because it's fairly common in kittens to get something, well, not common, I shouldn't say, but it's not uncommon. It definitely happens where sometimes kittens are born with cerebellar hypoplasia. So hypoplasia, so I'll just write this out here, cerebellar hypoplasia. So if we use our word parts, right, plasia is referring to growth, and then hypo is referring to deficient. So a deficient growth of the cerebellum. So that means that the cerebellum is a lot smaller than it's supposed to be, and we see that in those animals, posture, coordination, and balance really suffers. So those cats really, like, they stumble around, they can't stand up straight, they've got tremors, and they have kind of a funny meow as well. So cerebellar hypoplasia is something that can happen with kittens. So it's a good thing to know about that cerebellum. And then another part of the brain I'd like you to know is the amygdala. And this is the part of the brain that's responsible for emotions, especially fear and aggression. So I think this is an important one to know about, because when you have an animal that has a lot of severe anxiety or is in a very fearful state, this amygdala totally takes over. So we kind of jokingly sometimes call it like the lizard brain, or like the well, I guess the animal brain. Sometimes people will call it in humans, because it really just takes you back to the instinctual behavior of like run away or attack. Okay. So sometimes what happens in animals and in humans too, like if you've ever had any issues with anxiety, which I think is fairly common in our culture now, for sure, you're hearing a lot more people talking about it and experiencing it. But animals that are experiencing high levels of anxiety, this amygdala takes over. So it tells the body like you're in danger and you need to act appropriately because you're in extreme danger. So oftentimes though, our cute little pets aren't in extreme danger. Maybe they've just been left alone because you have to go to the grocery store. But their amygdala is telling them that you're never coming back and that they have to fight for their life now. Or maybe they're really scared of water. So it's just a bath. They're not going to die of the bath. But this amygdala is telling them that this is the end for them. So they need to fight and they need to get out of it. So there are some medications that kind of slow or dull the amygdala and allow that cerebrum to kind of take over. And this is the part that we want working for our animals when they're in an anxiety state, because this part is responsible for thinking and reasoning and seeing, oh, it's just a bath. I'm not dying. Whereas this guy here, if this is the one that's overriding the cerebrum, the amygdala, that animal just thinks that they're in severe danger and might die. So I think that's an important one to know about, because we do often have a lot of animals that we're dealing with that do have a lot of severe anxieties. So for the rest of the CNS, I'm not going to get into super details about the spine, but I will talk about spinal nerves. So spinal nerves, there are 3 that you need to know. There are many, but you only need to know 3. So the radial goes to the forelimb. So if you remember, in our forelimb, we have the humerus, which is the upper arm, and then we've got our radius and ulna in our forearm part here, right? So radial goes to that radius, the forearm. Then we have the sciatic. That goes to the hind limb. Maybe you know someone or have yourself sciatica. My mother has sciatica, and there are times that like she cannot walk because it's so painful to her. So that is that sciatic nerve going to the hind limb that's pinched or compromised in some way. And then lastly, there's the vagus nerve. It's spelled V-A-G-U-S, so not like V-E-G-A-S, the way like Las Vegas is. So the vagus nerve goes to the heart. Sometimes you'll hear about maybe like certain procedures or certain things causing a vagal response in an animal. A vagal response means that that vagus nerve has been stimulated and it is causing either an increase or a drop in heart rate. So that's a vagal response caused by that vagus nerve. So I've heard people say in the past that they remember it because like lots of people really seem to really love traveling to Vegas. I've never been personally, like Las Vegas, but Heart Vegas, I Heart Vegas, right? So they love it. They love going there. So those are the 3 spinal nerves you need to know. So there's a couple other terms in this CNS section. I spelled this wrong. Meninges. It's hard to spell and talk at the same time, believe it or not. So the meninges, these are the membranes lining the CNS. So it covers the brain, covers the spine. I don't think it covers the spinal nerves, to be honest. I think it's just the spine and the brain. But that's the meninges. So sometimes you'll hear about meningitis, right? Meningitis would be inflammation of the meninges. So probably lots of us, if not all of us, I think it's one of the mandatory vaccines. So assuming that you've been vaccinated, you probably have a meningitis vaccine on board. There's like a big breakout when I was in junior high, I remember, and everyone had to have their meningitis vaccines boosted. And then there's like a little fluid then that covers in the spinal cord, and this is called Cerebro spinal fluid. So this is within the spinal canal. Surrounding the spinal cord. So you guys remember in the musculoskeletal section learning about the vertebrae. So we looked at the vertebrae always from the side, right? So we had bones, cartilage, bone, cartilage. One thing though that we did not really discuss is what these bones look like from the side. So depending on whereabouts they are located, because different ones have different like spines or these offshoots, but they all have like a hole in the middle, and that hole is where the spine comes through. So if the spine is about this thick, all the surrounding area is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid, if you get an epidural or you have a spinal tap or you have a like spinal anesthetic, that is, so an epidural or a spinal anesthetic is putting in a drug into this space. If you have a spinal tap, it's taking fluid out of that. Okay, just making sure I didn't miss anything in the CNS here. If you want to see, there's some diagrams of the brain. So McBride, I'll maybe put it up here. McBride, there's figure 14-6 on page 287. You can have a look at that. It gives you kind of a little bit of a diagram. Also Elsevier, I'm just going to put E for Elsevier. Page 88, figure 4-20. So those give you some figures of the CNS, or the central nervous system. So let's move on now to our peripheral nervous system, so the PNS. So the peripheral nervous system we already discussed is kind of just like the rest, all the rest of the nerves. So it doesn't talk about the brain, it doesn't talk about the spinal cord or those spinal nerves, but it's all the other nerves that go throughout the body. So let's start off by drawing a nerve cell. So we have our cell body. Cell body is where all like the cell good stuff resides. So if you remember back to biology in high school, we're talking mitochondria, we're talking the nucleus, we're talking all your other cell organelles. So those are all in the cell body. And then we got these short little extensions, and they're called dendrites. And we have a really long extension coming off of it, and that's called the axon. So the axon often is covered with this white matter that's called myelin sheath. So basically how nerve cells work is they send electrical impulses throughout the body. So I don't know if you knew that, but basically our bodies are run on electricity. So just the same way, like if you have a wire going from your TV that you plug into the wall, we don't just have exposed wires, right? They're covered in that kind of rubbery, plasticky material that protects it's like an insulator, right? It protects the electricity to stay within the wire and not jump out into other areas that could conduct that electricity. The myelin sheath does the same thing. It keeps the electricity traveling through the axon in the axon, so it's not jumping into other nerves and sending mixed messages. You've probably heard about MS, multiple sclerosis. As far as I know, MS doesn't affect animals, but it does certainly affect people. Typically people with MS will have symptoms where they can't necessarily control the part of the body that they are intending to control, but other things are happening in their body while like they're trying to move their hand, let's say. That's because multiple sclerosis, this myelin sheath has multiple scars. Sclerosis is referring to scarring. So there's like holes basically in the myelin sheath, so electricity can jump and go where it shouldn't be. So this myelin sheath acts as an insulator for the electrical impulses going through the body in the nerve cell. And then these axons connect with other cells. So these are the dendrites of other cells, other nerves. And then over here, these are coming off of other, okay? So, so that's how we have this like network of nerves throughout the body. So the space between the axon of one cell and the dendrites of the other, that's called the synapse. The synapse is basically just the space between them, okay? In that space, we have something called neuron synapse fluid. And neuron synapse fluid is a neurotransmitter. So I'm going to try to just really simplify this. If you're really interested in how nerves work and how electrical impulses go throughout the body, etc., you can certainly read more about it. I think your textbooks might have some more info. I'm sure you're going to find stuff online as well if you looked there. But basically how neurons work is that they send out these electrical impulses along the axon. When it gets to the end of the axon, those electrical impulses send a signal to release a chemical, okay? So chemicals are things like serotonin, dopamine. Do those sound familiar to you? Those are often chemicals that are talked about when there's like we talk about a brain imbalance, right? So sometimes people might have not enough or too much serotonin, okay? So anyways, those chemicals are released into this neurotransmitter, or which is called the neuron synapse fluid. It can travel through the fluid, be picked up by receptors on the dendrite end, which converts that message into an electrical impulse that goes through the neuron. Okay, so we need a fluid to carry these dissolved chemicals from one to the other. The electricity can't just do that jump, so it triggers a chemical release that gets picked up on this side and triggers a electrical impulse. So that neuron synapse fluid is in the synapse, and that neuron synapse fluid is a neurotransmitter. So neurons have these two processes, right? So we have the dendrites and the axon. So axon carries impulses away from the cell body. So A, right? Hopefully that's a good way for you to remember which one's doing which. And then dendrites carry towards the cell body. So dendrites are just the opposite of the axon. I'm just looking at my notes here. Okay, so then there are two different types of neurons kind of generalized in the body. Okay, so we have afferent neurons, which are sensory neurons. And we have efferent neurons, which are motor neurons. So if we think of, I'm just going to draw the brain again. This is the brain and the spinal cord. If we think of afferent neurons as arriving at the CNS and efferent neurons as exiting the CNS, I feel like that helps. Sorry, I just realized I bumped my phone here. There we go. Sorry about that. So we're talking about afferent and efferent neurons. So I have a brain and a spinal cord here, okay? So my afferent neurons are arriving at the brain. So afferent equals arriving at the CNS. And then, so coming in, and then going out is the efferent. Or they're exiting the CNS. So basically, like, let's think of a sensory neuron. So we've got, this is a cat eye. It's not a great eye, but anyway, that's a cat's eye, okay? It's carrying sensory information to the brain. And then the exiting of the efferent are sending information to the muscles to react or do something. Okay, so let's think of an example I think that can hopefully make a lot of sense to us and will show us just how quickly our sensory system really works. It's pretty amazing, honestly. So I have my hand and I have a hot stove. I touch the hot stove and my sensory neurons that detect heat and pain in my fingers pick up the fact that the stove is hot and that it hurts to touch it. They send that information up my arm, through my body, into my CNS or my brain and my spinal cord. And then my brain and my spinal cord processes that information. It says, oh wow, that stove's hot and it hurts to touch it. Hey, arm, move your hand away from the stove. And so I do that right away, okay? Now think of how quick that actually is. So I just narrated it and I mean, that seems quick, but really the reality of it is, oh, ow, oh, that really hurts, right? So it's really, really quick how fast our brain works to process the information coming in from the sensory or the afferent nerves and send the messages from the efferent to our muscles to react, okay? So it's really quite amazing just how quickly it all works. Okay, so I think, one last thing to talk about is reflexes. Okay, so I'm actually just going to show you guys reflexes on my term sheet here. I'm just going to flip this over. So a reflex is basically an automatic involuntary response to a stimulus. So we can use reflexes to assess the health of the nervous system in animals. So you guys are probably familiar with like at least one, well, probably two reflexes in humans, I would hope. One is, you know, the one you hit your knee with the hammer and then your leg kicks out. That's a reflex. So the stimulus is hitting the knee with the hammer. The reflex is that your leg kicks out. So you don't necessarily have control over that. Your leg just goes ahead and does it. Another one is if, you know, something is coming quick at your eye, you blink, right? So that's a reflex as well. And that's one that animals have too. So there are 5 different reflexes you should know. So the PLR is the pupillary light reflex. This is the reflex that when you shine a bright light in an eye, the pupil, so like the black dot in the middle of the eye, gets smaller. So it constricts. Constricts means it closes up. Okay, so that's a pupillary light reflex. So if you shine a bright light in the eye and that doesn't respond, we know that that animal is honestly quite possibly dead, but certainly has had a brain injury at least. I'm gonna skip toe pinch for now, and I'm gonna go down to the next two because they're both eye reflexes. I think I reordered these when I typed up your guys' notes. So the palpebral reflex. So what's the palpebrae? Do we remember? It's the eyelids. Actually, wait, I'm asking you, do we remember? But we haven't covered the eye yet. So you might not have known that one, and that's okay. But the palpebral reflex, basically if you touch the medial canthus of the eye, so the medial canthus means the corner of the eye, right? So if this is the nose, this is the medial canthus because it's more towards the midline. This out here would be the lateral canthus, okay? So lateral medial. So when you touch the medial canthus of the eye, tap, tap, that eye goes blink, blink. So the eye should blink in response to touch of that medial canthus. And then our next eye-related reflex is the corneal eye reflex. So when you touch the cornea is the outermost part of the eye. So like if you just touched your eyeball right now, you'd be touching the cornea. When you touch the cornea, it leads to a reflex closure of the palpebral fissure. The palpebral fissure is just the gap between the eyelids, right? So you touch the cornea, it makes the eyes close. So we can use these two to gauge the depth of anesthetic when we have an animal under anesthetic. So we don't want an animal getting too deep under anesthetic because it could stop their heart and their breathing. And obviously we don't want to kill our animals that are in for a space surgery. But we also don't want the animals to be really light under anesthetic because then they're feeling everything happening during their surgery, and that's quite cruel. So we want to kind of find the perfect balance between the two, and these reflexes help us do this. So you'll see technologists tapping the corners of pets' eyes all the time while they're under anesthetic, especially when we're just getting them under, when we're getting them induced or just starting anesthetic for them. Because we want them to be asleep enough that this palpebral reflex disappears. We don't want to see it anymore. But if the corneal eye reflex disappears, my animal is way too deep under anesthetic and I'm risking stopping the heart and breathing. So I need to keep the animal somewhere between this one disappearing and this one disappearing. Okay, so I want no palpebral, but I want that corneal eye reflex present. So these two are great when we're dealing with anesthetic. So I'm gonna bump back now to the toe pinch reflex. So the toe pinch reflex is if you pinch or tickle the skin web between the toes, that animal's gonna jerk back their leg. Animals tend to hate having our nail trims because of that reflex. They're like, oh God, come on, and they're just jerking their foot back and forth. So this toe pinch can be helpful to assess whether or not there's like damage to the spine and then paralysis in the legs. So we can tell if an animal is limping or not limping, sorry, is not using a leg because of a spinal injury or a nerve injury if this toe pinch reflex is gone. So we can pinch all those things, and if the animal doesn't react, that signals to me that there's something wrong somewhere along here. I've seen doctors do so far because like sometimes they'll lose this, but they'll have deep pain still. So if you pinch really hard, they'll react. But I've seen doctors get like a hemostat out and really pinch on that and the animal not react at all. That's how we know an animal has paralysis. And then our last one that we need to know is the knuckling reflex. So this means that when you place the paw into its dorsum position, so right now this would be palmar position, this is dorsum position. So like the back of the hand or the back of the paw is touching the ground. When we put that paw into dorsum, the animal immediately flips it back into the normal. So either palmar or plantar. So if you have pets at home, do this one. Try it out. It's a really interesting one to watch because yeah, it's just like so instant for them. Sometimes you can't even really get them to put their foot down. They're already reflex putting it back. Again, we can use this to assess like paralysis or nerve damage to the legs. So if we put an animal into this dorsum and it doesn't move, that's a really big red flag for me that something's going on there that I should be worried about. Okay, so we've talked about the reflexes now. Let's just go over some of the terms. So again, sorry, my sheet is a lot messier than yours will be because this is just an old one I've been scribbling notes on. So paresis, that is a suffix that means weakness. Plegia means paralysis. So analgesia. So the E is just pertaining to analgesia. I'm messing it up here. Anyway, the analgesia is referring to pain. An is without, right, or lacking. So analgesia means the animal isn't feeling pain. Often we'll give an analgesic, so a drug that removes pain or prevents pain. Anesthesia, so esthese is sensation. An is a lack of or without, so an absence of sensation. Anesthesia, that animal is completely unaware to the world. I'm not sure if any of you have had anesthesia, general anesthetic before, but I have, so I will share my experience with you. So basically, I've had general anesthetic a couple times, unfortunately. Basically, yeah, they're kind of like, okay, start counting down, or they give you like an injection into your IV, and then you're just like out. You kind of fall asleep, and that's it. And then you wake up, and so I had a 3-hour surgery one time under anesthesia, and I woke up, and it felt like I had just fallen asleep. So you basically lose that time. You have no sensation whatsoever during that time. It's really quite fascinating. We talked about the cerebral hemisphere already. We talked about the meninges. Meningitis is inflammation of that meninges, so the membrane surrounding brain and spinal cord. So we talked about myelin being the sheath, like on our nerve cell here, the myelin sheath. Myelin is also in other parts of the body as well. So it covers some nerves of the spinal cord. It covers most peripheral nerves. And it makes up the white matter of the brain. Perhaps you guys have heard reference to like gray matter and white matter. The white matter is the myelin, the gray matter is all the nerves. Ataxia. So if you think of taxi as referring to like movement, and a meaning like a lack of, and ataxia is like it's a lack of coordinated movement. So the animal's stumbling kind of seems like they're drunk. Ataxia. We talked about spinal fluid, and I talked about those motor neurons for you guys. So that, and just making sure I don't have any other written in ones. I think we covered all those. Yeah, looks like it. Okay, so that is all the lecture then for the, the nervous system, sorry. If you are interested in doing textbook reading on the nervous system, you can find it on Elsevier, pages 88 to 90. And in your McBride textbook, chapter 14 covers the nervous system. I have, as always, that review for you guys. So there is a review. You can go over the practice activity to kind of work with this material and engage with it. And of course, as always, if you do have any questions, make sure you do write them down, save them to ask me in the virtual classroom, ask me in the chat, or if you can't wait and it's not class time, go ahead and email me, okay? I'm definitely available to answer any questions you guys do have. So thank you so much for listening to this lecture about the nervous system, and we'll see you in the virtual classroom. Bye!